the Tea Party is a lot of things, and it may or may not be a protest, but it's definitely not a boycott because people aren't getting to choose whether or not to consume it, right? When people have boycotts of this or that consumer good or items from this or that country, that's different from an organized political entity destroying the product before they can make a choice about whether they participate. In many ways, the Tea Party is a little bit more like sanctions than a boycott in that way.
Hi, James. Welcome to Echoes of History. It's great to have you with us.
Oh, thank you. Pleasure to be here.
And we were talking before we started about whether I'm being indelicate bringing a cup of tea to a discussion about the Boston Tea Party, but you assured me it was probably okay.
I think so.
I might need the caffeine hit as we talk about the destruction of tea. It's not good for my health. First off, I guess we're going to talk about the Boston Tea Party. Can you tell us when the Boston Tea Party took place? Whereabouts in history are we?
Yes. Well, I suppose the where is obvious, Boston, and the when, December 16th, 1773. So we've just had the 250th anniversary. There were big commemorations at the time when it happened. And it is this moment that historians often point to as the tipping point between a period we call the Imperial Crisis, when there are many anti-ministerial protests across North American colonies and also in the British Caribbean, and then to a period in which it moves straight on to what is often called the revolution, the American Revolution itself, right? The intensive revolt and then warfare that leads to U.S. independence. And so it's usually pointed to as an inflection point that moved from one to the other.
And you say the where is obvious. Obviously, it's Boston. But yeah. I'm going to make a really niche joke here in that I'm from the Black Country in England, where Boston means something really, really good. So a Boston Tea Party would be a really, really good tea party, rather than being something in Boston. So it's a very, very niche accent-based joke about where I'm from.
Well, very good. I have fond recollections of many years at the British Library. Boston Spa is where they keep their off-site records.
And obviously we're not talking about a tea party in the sense that we might throw a tea party today or attend a tea party today. It makes it sound like a very genteel affair, like everyone in Boston was getting on really, really well, and they had some sandwiches and cakes and drank some tea. It's really not that. So kind of just at the highest level, what happens at the Boston Tea Party and why does it get called a Boston Tea Party if it's not a party?
Yeah, that's a good question. And, maybe a good way to start it is just with the word tea, which, in British English means many different things, including an evening meal and including a drink at different times of the day. So we have to remember that the words they use then aren't necessarily carrying the same meaning that we have in them now. And that British and American listeners now may have different intentions and meanings to the word. So the Boston Tea Party then wasn't called the Boston Tea Party at the time. It accrued that name maybe 40 or 50 years later. It was the name was a joke. A joke is a strong noun. It was a light jest at best, just sort of saying that it was a protest and that it was a group activity, and also conveying the sense that it was light and jocular in a certain way, although it was not at all a jocular affair. And so I think maybe Americans have absorbed, there is both a lighthearted element and people having fun and a sincere meant element of protest and concern about rights and privileges and so forth. And in many ways, none of that is true, but that's the way that American popular history has tried to remember it, because it's attractive to remember it that way.
Is it one of those things that had a different name at the time, or did people not refer to it by a specific name when it happened?
They often called it just the destruction of the tea, which is a terrible name and is very vague.
Yeah, no wonder that didn't stick.
Yeah. And in fact, the funny thing about the Tea Party is that it wasn't really commemorated at the time. And there were some annual commemorations a year later, but because, one of the reasons we call it the American Revolution and we call it a revolution is that change happened rapidly. Intense and deep change happened quickly. And so within a year or two after the Boston Tea Party, there are bigger events that are more important in their moment than commemorating something that happened just a year or two earlier. And those bigger events become more valuable for commemoration. The most obvious one being U.S. independence, being something to commemorate in July of 76, and not to commemorate the Boston Tea Party or the first shots fired at the Battle of Lexington. Those are not heavily commemorated the way independence is or other such things. So it was quickly lost in its commemorations. There had been various commemorations in Boston before that throughout the 1770s. The Boston Massacre, as it was called, 5 people died. I'm sorry to say, but that's a shopping mall in America on any day of the week today. But it was considered propagandized as a massacre at the time. So 5 people died. And that had annual commemorations. And in fact, after the Boston Tea Party, it was the Boston Massacre commemoration. That was the big oratory event in March of 1774 and in March of 1775, not the Boston Tea Party. So it was not a big commemoration, in part because it was embarrassing and a little bit shameful. It was illegal. Whereas the Boston Massacre was the violent killing of British civilians by British troops. And so it's something you can lay at the foot of the ministry and a parliament. Whereas to commemorate the Boston Tea Party is to commemorate your own law breaking if you're a revolutionary. And that's something they weren't quite ready to own up to. Revolutions are illegal. And that can be a little hard for some people to admit to themselves.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? And I guess then after the revolution has been successful and there's a time for reflection, moments like the Boston Tea Party maybe begin to take on more importance as stepping stones towards that. So in the moment, it might not have felt like, we're changing the world by doing this. It's only when everything has happened, settled down, and you begin to look back that you can pick out some of these moments as those kind of cornerstones on the journey there, that they start to take on a more importance than they might have felt they had at the time.
Yeah, and also it takes on this importance. We have this in contemporary culture now with World War II veterans, and you might, I don't know if you remember 20 or 30 years ago with World War I veterans. There were few World War I veterans left. They were all in their 110s at the time. We all knew they wouldn't be with us much longer. And there was this commemoration remembering what they did. I remember reading last June recollections of D-Day veterans landing in Normandy and what that meant. And so these men would all be in their 90s, right? So this Boston Tea Party commemoration started up really in the 1820s when it was 50 years after the fact, and many of the participants were elderly, if alive at all. And it became a question of, can we interview and take the oral recollections of people who were there while they're still even alive? And that reflected a time in American history and culture in the 1820s when it was very clear the revolutionary generation was passing. And of course, there wasn't a revolutionary generation. George Washington was quite old compared to other men like even Thomas Jefferson or John Adams. So they had an age gap. And yet both the men who could have been were the age to be soldiers, which was a broad range back then, or the men who were political leaders, were definitely no longer with them by the 1820s in meaningful numbers. And so it was now a question of who are we as Americans now that the people that were there at the beginning are gone. What does it mean to be us? So it was this recrystallization of national identity around interviewing these people. And many of these interviews were fake and where people could get fame by either cooking up an interviewee that was less reliable than true, or an interviewee could recall things incorrectly or not even have been there. And so a lot of these are questionable sources that we need to read with some care.
Assassin's Creed 3 allows players to take part in the Boston Tea Party. And if you've played it or if you watch that level from the game, one of the things that's, I think, quite striking, quite noticeable, is that it takes place at night, whereas many of the depictions we often see of it in paintings or engravings or anything like that make it look like it happened during the day. Do we know kind of at what point of day it took place, what time it took place, and would it have been light or dark? I mean, I guess we're in December, so in the heart of winter in Boston.
Yes, it would have been quite dark. It took place probably between 6 and 9, something like that. So definitely dark. And notably, Boston had one of the Tea Party ships had brought the street lamps that were to be installed in Boston. Boston did not yet have formal city-owned street lamps. There were, of course, lamps on private buildings, but so the lighting would have been limited beyond that. It would have been moonlight and little else, torchlight. So it would have been darkly lit, if really lit at all, and it would have been at night. So therefore, it's easier to disguise your identity as a participant in an illegal enterprise if you do it at night, when no one can really recognize you.
Probably a very good point, a good reason to do it in the dark. In the game as well, it's presented as very much a premeditated, highly organised protest event. So the player is tasked with waiting outside of a town meeting until they hear a signal from Samuel Adams to the crowd. And then Samuel Adams in the game gathers a group he calls the Sons of Liberty, and they head down to the harbour, board the ships and dump all of the tea. Do we know whether it was as organised as that? Was it not a spontaneous thing? Was it this highly organised?
Yes, it was extremely well organized. And there were many things that fed into this. It was, one can call it a protest, I suppose, but it was organized in a weeks ahead, premeditated kind of a way. And protests can include that. But of course, the word protest also can imply spontaneity, right? And that's not at all what's happening here. When the first tea ship had arrived, there was a 20-day time frame in which the cargo had to be unloaded. And if it weren't unloaded, the customs officers would seize it or seize the goods for non-payment of duty. And having impounded them would then auction them off to raise the money to pay the duty. And therefore, the tea would be seized by the customs officers in the morning and then auctioned. Therefore, it would be sold and available to the Boston public. And it was, everyone knew this time was happening, and therefore they had to destroy the tea before it could be sold to the public, because the public might buy it. And that would be a little embarrassing for this protest movement that was claiming that this tea was something people didn't want. So in order to maintain the false narrative that this consumer good was not desired, they needed to destroy it before anyone could poke a hole in it. And so the Tea Party is a lot of things, and it may or may not be a protest, but it's definitely not a boycott, because people aren't getting to choose whether or not to consume it, right? When people have boycotts of this or that consumer good or items from this or that country, that's different from an organized political entity destroying the product before they can make a choice about whether they participate. In many ways, the Tea Party is a little bit more like sanctions than a boycott in that way. Yeah, definitely premeditated, like in all politics, right? When something's going to go bad, politicians want to try to make sure the other guy takes the blame for it going badly, right? So you see this in Parliament all the time. You see this in Congress. You see this everywhere. And in this case, it was, if there's going to be a violent denouement, the revolutionaries weren't sure they interpreted destroying the tea as a good thing, worried that people would not approve of it. And they were right. People disapproved of it quite widely. Therefore, they wanted to try to blame the Governor Hutchinson, for it, or the customs officers, or the men who were hired by the East India Company who were contracted by the East India Company to receive the tea and sell it. They wanted them to shoulder the blame. And so the whole period up to the Tea Party is this game of the radicals trying to ask the men who were charged with landing the tea and selling it to renounce their role in landing the tea and selling it, and to send the tea back to England. And then these men say, oh, we'd like to. Sometimes they say this, sometimes they don't. In Boston, they're more resistant, but in other port towns where tea is sent, they do ultimately say we'd like to. But then in Boston, the customs officers say, no, it's not allowed. Once the ship's arrived and into the customs area, you have to land and pay duty before it's returned. And so each step, there's this intransigence where the people on the ministry side are trying to land the tea. And the people on the radical side are trying to make sure that if the tea is destroyed, they can kind of say, the consignees, those are the men who had to receive the tea, or the customs officers, they made us do it. They gave us no choice. We had no choice but to destroy it. And of course, that's not true. They could have just done nothing. They could have followed the law. But they want to sort of leave this to their blame. And so these town meetings in the days before are very much about making every possible effort to get the governor to make an exception, or to get the customs officers to make an exception to the rules, to get the ship owner or the men who are charged with handling the cargo to make an exception, and getting each of them on the record saying no. And each of them also all make very conspicuous efforts, like the ship owners, for example, that they've done everything they could to try to resolve the situation because they don't want their ships destroyed. So it becomes this game in this way. And then after all that gamesmanship is finished, then they destroy the tea. But that time they've had this crew of picked men who are guarding the wharf. Obviously, the customs officers do that. But then you have the radicals have these other men who are there to make sure the tea doesn't get legally offloaded by its owners. So, yeah, very organized. And much more so than most other protests.
It's interesting how much groundwork has gone into what might have felt like a really spontaneous moment. They've actually spent days building up to all of this and, as you say, laying the groundwork for blaming lots of other people for what's going on too. Do we have any sense that there was this moment where a signal is given by Samuel Adams or someone like that there is a moment where, you know, he or someone has decided, that's it, now we go and dump the tea?
Yes. The people who say it was intended as a signal are interpreting that to be the case. There's no actual proof that that's the case, but it's a very plausible interpretation. As he says something like, nothing more can be done to save the country or something like this. And this is the signal that, therefore, the town meeting can do no more to get the ship owners and consignees to stop importing the tea, and therefore they must do extra legal or illegal action. But, you know, one of the things that's key there is it's the town meeting, which is not just a bunch of people hanging out. It's a legal political body. A town meeting is the body of townsmen and that can vote, coming together and that vote and resolve on issues, that elect the town selectmen, that vote on taxing and spending for the year. And so it is one of the beefs that the ministry will have in the succeeding year, is that it wasn't just that there was an angry crowd, but it was the town meeting and the town leadership who are supposed to be sober, sensible political leaders. I don't know how much you know about 18th century Parliament, but there aren't a lot of sober people in it. So it's like, it's a crazy idea to expect that the Boston town meeting would have been sober, sensible people. But there was this expectation in the sense they violated the trust of governance, basically, and being basically a tool of, as the ministry said, democratic behavior, mob rule. And therefore, this is part of why the ministry subsequently wanted to denude the town meeting of substantive political authority.
And who was Samuel Adams? You know, how is he in a position to be leading this and maybe to be giving a signal that the moment has arrived to go?
Sam Adams, and the other man would be John Hancock, who are these two noted American revolutionary figures. They stand out for being early leadership in the revolution and for not ending up on American money or on being American presidents later. So that's this unusual moment. They're both early in that sense. But they're key leaders, and neither of them go to the Boston Tea Party because they're known to be major leaders of it. Now, it doesn't mean they weren't involved because they didn't go, right? You can have a mafia capo who sits in prison and orchestrates a hit on someone from prison. He orchestrated the hit, and the prison CCTV can record that he never left the prison yard during the time of the execution he ordered. So these are leaders, but they're so well known as leaders that they stay in the church, the Old South Meeting House where the town meeting was held. They stay in the church after it is announced that the meeting is closed. So there can be witnesses seeing them there at the church and not at the dock because they know that they'll be fingered as criminal actors. And they're right. The ministry immediately says, all right, let's figure out a way to pin this on them because we know they organized, and they definitely did. But they're smart enough to keep their hands a bit distant from it.
It's almost like the fact that they're so conspicuous in creating that alibi is the admission of guilt.
Yes. And I mean, I make that analogy very purposely because I think one of the best analogies here is to organized crime. And the difference between politics and organized crime in the 18th century isn't that different when you consider how corrupt 18th century politics is in Britain. And so this is a situation in which there's a lot that's going unsaid, that if you violate what the organizers want, you can get yourself in trouble. So the Paul Revere, another revolutionary leader of this era, for example, was elected onto the grand jury for Boston in 1774, which would sit impaneled for all of the indictments for that year. And after the Boston Tea Party, the normal legal procedure to pursue would be to seek a criminal indictment or to sue for damages, right? And there was also a vice admiralty court where one could sue as well. But if you saw an indictment and brought it to a grand jury, now you have a revolutionary leader like Paul Revere on the grand jury. And so what's he going to do if you testify about who you saw at the Boston Tea Party? If you name names of the Boston Tea Party, you can expect that a few drunk blokes will pull you aside at the pub tomorrow, beat you half to death. So maybe you're not going to testify. As a result, the Attorney General cannot bring an indictment in the Boston Tea Party. He seeks an indictment. He tries to get an indictment, but no one's willing to testify. No one's willing to provide witness testimony. And even when the British government sends out a new military governor, he writes back his frustration that he hears all sorts of rumors about what happened. He's still seeking to bring, he thinks, criminal indictments for the Boston Tea Party are the way to go to force an ownership on the revolutionary leadership of the meaning of their actions. And he simply can't bring an indictment because no one will squeal. And so there is this mafia-esque omerta. They keeps everyone quiet. And that is a sign of just how organized political activity is, right? That they can operate on this level with impunity.
Fascinating that everyone has laid the groundwork so carefully and sort of everyone knows what's going on, but it's what you can prove and what you can get put through a court is very different from what everybody is aware of is what really is happening.
You know, I don't know about in Britain, but in the United States, it was impossible to indict people for organized crime really before the 20th century. You couldn't have these indictments for things like conspiracy or racketeering especially, right? And these sort of indictments are what allowed the U.S. government to go after organized criminal activity in the 20th century. Before that, to indict someone for involvement in something in which they were not directly at hand doing would have been extremely difficult. You would have had to get witnesses to each step in the conspiracy along the way, and it would have been completely impossible. And so there is this, I think the problem is you can accept this naivete of if you don't have a witness that puts someone there and so forth, then he wasn't there and wasn't involved. But that asks us to be naive about how politics works, right?
In the game, in Assassin's Creed 3, the player character is half Mohawk, so he's half Native American, and he's seen during the process of dumping the tea and viewed by those who see it as part of the criminal element. Is it true that lots of those involved in the Boston Tea Party disguise themselves as Native Americans? You know, the game doesn't show everybody doing that, but is this sort of an allusion to everybody else disguising themselves in that way?
Yeah, this is a fascinating question. I think the game handles this very well by having the main character do this. The Mohawk element is even better. Mohawks were said to have been involved in the Tea Party, but it's a big walk from Mohawk country to Boston, and it's many, many days walk. And so it is. And Mohawks live in New York State today, where we live what is now New York State, then New York Colony, nowhere near Boston, hundreds of miles away. So it's not even the right Native American group. But yes, people with Mohawks were said to be there. They're painted in popular culture and memory as Native American, people dressing as Native American, right? Some may well have done so. And newspaper accounts of the time describe some people dressed in this way. But a lot of people just took lamp black, just the soot from the lamps, not the street lamps because they're not up, but the other ones, and just blacked out their faces like a commando would do today. That, plus it being dark out, was enough to plausibly disguise their identity. And remember that how much do you have to disguise your identity? Well, you have to make a plausible effort to disguise it so that the person who's already knows he's going to deny recognizing you can plausibly deny recognizing you if he's forced to do it in a court of law. So it's not like you have to be perfectly disguised. Boston was a town of 15,000 people, so some people did not know each other, but many people did. And if you think about the kinds of people who would have been asked to testify, the most obvious people were the men on Ships are not left unattended at the dock. That's dangerous. So there were crew on the ship at the time of the Boston Tea Party, and they're part of the maritime world. So they're working these jobs, going across the Atlantic and this or that trade, and they go to the same taverns and pubs as the working men who are in the Sons of Liberty, which is a paramilitary underground organization. So they want to get along with these people. And so the day after the Boston Tea Party, the first thing they all do is go swear out an affidavit that claims that they don't recognize anyone from the Boston Tea Party. First thing they do. So that if they're ever brought to court, their future testimony can be impeached by the affidavit they sworn. And therefore they won't get attacked. And they can be at peace with their crewmates, right? And they can have a peaceful drink. Well, they can have as riotous a drink as they want without being assaulted in the pub, and have a good time with their mates. And that's the end of it. So there is some of this disguising, but how much would be Native American disguise or other? Whether any actual Native Americans were involved, I don't know. It was a running joke. So John Adams pointed out that he wanted the Mashpee Indians, I think he said, for those associated with Cape Cod, to destroy the other tea ship. But it was this sort of running gag. And there is this light association between the colonists associating themselves as Native Americans as being Americans and not Britons by using Native American garb. But that's an association that only works because the Native Americans in New England are either exterminated or fully in check to the point where for white colonists, it's not a threat.
I mean, I was wondering when I was asking that question whether the things that might have been going on were to do with associating yourself with being more American than British. So as you say, you would align yourself as a Native American to distinguish from being a British colonist at that point. Whether as part of that pre-planning, there had been an effort to think of a group that you could kind of blame for it. That plausible deniability of any involvement. But it sounds almost like it's, in an effort to put some soot on their face to disguise their faces enough. It was just that maybe made them look like some of them might have been Native American, and it's almost like a mistake. So that maybe there wasn't as much planning around the idea of involving or blaming Native Americans as there might have been.
Yeah, I don't think that the around the Native American part is not as well planned. I mean, we know people were organized into troops. They were marched in columns to do the Boston Tea Party, the Sons of Liberty. They were asked to empty their boots afterwards to make sure there wasn't any tea in them. But with the Native American part, yeah, on the one hand, I don't think there's very little plausible evidence. It's been looked at before, but that any serious amount of the participants in the Boston Tea Party sought U.S. independence at that time, or would have conceived of being an American as anything other than a subset of being British, in the same way that one can have be proudly Scottish, but still assume to be British, right? Today. And that would be the case for Americans then. And so the idea that to be American would be is separate it took colonists over a year of warfare to even admit to themselves that it wasn't going to work anymore. So I think that suggests it was very far from their minds. But there is also a way in which they're kind of having it on. I think the newspapers push the Native American element especially heavily. So in other words, they start saying, oh, don't blame us, that the Indians did it. And it's part of that sort of mafia-esque joking about, I'm going to we'll deny official involvement. The town and the colony will deny involvement. The citizens have no idea we were invaded by Indians. They came out of nowhere. They did this and then they left and we have no idea what's going on. And that you're just going to tell that lie with a straight face and force the other side to deal with it. It's part of the power move.
Yeah, it's a fascinating kind of almost brinkmanship, isn't it? Of we know that we did it. We know that you know that we did it, but you can't prove that we did it. So we're going to deflect all over the place. We're going to we're just going to obfuscate everything and make it so uncertain that you will never be able to prove this in a court of law, even though you know we did it and we know we did it.
Yeah, and the courts of law that matter are all in Massachusetts, so there's no way to have a trial. There is the ministry contemplates, the Attorney General and Solicitor General in London consider bringing treason charges, which are the only charges that you can try in England for crimes that happened outside of England. Because, of course, you could plot against the king from France. Obviously, that's where all evil plots against English kings clearly come from. So they think, and so from Henry VIII's day onward, treason charges are like that. But then how do you just charge this as treason? It's insane. So they try to come up with a way in which it's treason, but they're like, no, this is not possible. We're not even going to try. Because, of course, if this is chargeable as treason, basically any obstruction of government office or any property crime is chargeable as treason. And that's not really a place that British law wants to go in the 1770s. So they give that up.
There's nothing more British than wanting to make the destruction of tea a treasonable offence.
Yes, right, yes. But it's funny, though, because there are other tea parties, including other tea shipments, right, by the East India Company. And none of the others have this level of political focus from the ministry, right? So part of what you were asking initially causes this inflection from broad-based protest that's low-key and broad-based and spread out across the colonies, something that's focused on Boston. There are 3 other major cities that got tea shipments and that had protest activity. And the ministry deliberately focuses on Boston with the theory that Boston is the most misbehaved and recalcitrant. And therefore, if they punish them, all the others will fall in line. So they choose to do the hardest part first and think the other stuff will sort itself out. And I suspect that if they had done the reverse and gone after the easier cities, they could have picked off the hard city later and maybe averted a war.
I want to get into a bit more detail about tea in a second, but before we do that, we've mentioned the Sons of Liberty around Samuel Adams a couple of times now. So I just wanted to get into a bit about who the Sons of Liberty are. What were they founded for? What do we know about their makeup?
They date from the Stamp Act protests in the 1760s, in 1765, and they remained active thereafter. They disappear, really, in 1775, once militia activity and open warfare becomes the main place of action. They're an illegal underground paramilitary organization. Pardon the analogy. I don't know if it's more offensive to Americans or Brits, but it's a lot like the IRA, having a paramilitary wing and a political wing. And this sort of game, this is a useful game because you can have this polite political leadership that pretends they don't know what the guys with the guns are doing, but obviously they're taking advantage of the situation to achieve goals, and they're coordinating together. Hamas works the same way. This is how you work when you're the small guy and you're operating against a large empire or a large state with much power. You're not expecting to match them. They don't even have an army yet. So they're working men largely. Working class is an industrial era concept in many ways. So it's kind of hard to quite say that people in the colonies were working class. Sailors, dock workers, carpenters, smiths. Now carpentry and smith work, mason work is skilled labor, right? So it's not quite the same as a day laborer. Many of the protesters at the Boston Tea Party were members of the Masonic order. So we're masons, both literally as stoneworkers, but also they were masons. So that provided another another supply of personnel into the Sons of Liberty. And we have a few name lists that sort of where people would write down their names as who attended this meeting. And it tends to not be the revolutionary leadership we recognize. It's not John Adams. It's not Robert Treat Paine. It's not Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton. So they have this upper strata of lawyers. Many of the American revolutionary leaders are lawyers, merchants, and plantation owners who are the polite political leadership. They're the congressmen, they're presidents, they're governors, and state legislators. And then you have this Sons of Liberty strata below it, and a different social class. And they have this awkward relationship with each other because sometimes the Sons of Liberty is useful and it can organize larger crowds. So they can get a group of picked men out there, and then they can just get another 100 or 1,000 guys from the bars and pubs out onto the street to multiply their numbers and can kind of attempt to organize this activity. But the Sons of Liberty don't have 20th century communist or totalitarian fascist style control, right? It's an 18th century organization, so they can't really control the mob very well. They can control it a bit. And then the polite leaders have some influence over the Sons of Liberty, but the Sons of Liberty might see things differently and take things to a different direction in terms of property crimes than the polite leadership wants. And then the polite leadership usually tries to cover up the difference later. And so this is part of why we say it becomes a revolution, because you have this moment when the polite leadership loses control. And in 75 and 76, they form militia, they start electing their own officers. That's always the sign of the people on top losing control. So that's the Sons of Liberty. And they exist in cells, not only in Boston, but in Philadelphia, in New York, in Charleston, up and down the North Atlantic seaboard. And, one place they don't exist was they did not exist in Halifax. And Halifax had two tea parties. And there was also another one elsewhere in Nova Scotia. But those tea parties never led to Nova Scotia joining the revolutionary movement. There were efforts. There was even a brief 100-person little mini militia that tried to march on Halifax. It didn't get very far. But there wasn't this political organization in the Sons of Liberty. And then the polite leaders have their committees of correspondence, which are basically, bear some analogy to Jacobin clubs and their ability to, these are leaders in individual towns corresponding with each other to coordinate activity and information. And so the Sons of Liberty is this separate parallel line. And Halifax had neither, and therefore it couldn't, these protests, Halifax had natural protests against the tea that never went anywhere because there were no political organizers to make hay of it.
Does that help explain why someone like Samuel Adams doesn't become, one of the founding fathers, isn't on money, because he's not part of that kind of polite, more public face of the early revolution? He's kind of doing the dirty work. Yeah,
he's hot-headed. John Hancock is a very wealthy merchant. Sam Adams has his moments, but you have this, it is hard to say. You've got this famous painting of him by Copley that sort of portrays that he's done very well as a smith, as a working man, and he's not poor. Someone like Paul Revere, who was a silversmith, did very well. Samuel Adams as well, did well, was not working class in that sense, but was maybe culturally tied to the crowd. It was more in terms of personality, more hot-headed, more disposition-wise. There's also William Gadsden in South Carolina, he's a plantation owner with 90 slaves, and he has a district of Charleston named after him. But he also built his own dock by his own hands to build up his economic prosperity. And so there is this, whether or not they're working class, often maybe their sensibilities and culture might be more aligned with the street and the crowd and the city rather than the drawing room.
And I guess the big question that we haven't really talked too much about is why tea? Why are they throwing huge quantities of, in particular, tea into the sea? Presumably it could have been another cargo that could have been coming in. I presume this isn't kind of evangelical coffee drinkers thinking that tea drinkers have got it all wrong. Why is it tea? What did tea represent? What did it mean?
So that's a great question. So I feel like for tea, it means a lot of different things. And there's been different scholars have made different arguments about it. One thing that's very clear is that by the 1770s, tea is quite widely consumed in the North American colonies. And to your question about Native Americans, even Native Americans drank tea by this time, out in Ohio country, for example. We have eyewitness accounts describing this. It is unlikely that slaves consumed tea, and it's questionable how much indentured servants consumed tea. But it seems that anyone above that stratum did, whether they were crew on ships or whether they were hired hands. And per capita consumption levels were about maybe half of Britain's at that time, where of course also the economic availability would vary across the social stratum. So this made tea widely enough available that it could be a protest item. So after the Boston Tea Party, about a year later, Congress announces what they call the Continental Association, which is this formal boycott of trade with Britain. and they boycott imports from Britain, exports to Britain. They boycott tea specifically, and they also boycott Madeira. They boycott Madeira wine because there were also these wine taxes. Madeira wine would not have been a viable protest item to get the same people up in the street upset. And so tea was more widely available, consumed by everyone. But you can also have this fancy version of tea because it exists in many grades. So you can have a cheap black tea that you steep weekly and that anyone can have a little bit of. It's watered down. Or you can have a fancy high-end tea that's expensive and that connotes your upper class role and have it on nice china and a nice tea set. And so it has this range in terms of income and wealth that it can express and fit in with. But the other piece, right, of why it's tea is the biggest failure of the colonial protest movement to date. Previously, the Townshend Acts had taxed 5 different goods. One of them was tea. And the Townshend Acts affected Ireland and Britain as well as North America. The North American element taxed paper, lead, glass, painter's colors or just paint, and tea. And there were widespread boycotts of this. The idea was that they were taxing goods that are being shipped from Britain to the colonies that are manufactured items or refined items. In the case of tea, the colonies don't produce, so they can generate tax revenue in this way. After widespread boycotts of Britain, trade with Britain, the tax on 4 of those 5 items is lifted. The tax on tea stays. And the colonists, the revolutionary leaders in the colonies say, now we're supposed to continue the tea boycott. And basically only 2 cities do, New York and Philadelphia. Boston, Charleston, Virginia, they all go back to importing tea from Britain in large amounts. And so by the time of the Boston Tea Party, about 40% of the tea coming into North America, legally imported East India Company tea, is coming into North America, and it's coming about 40% of it to Boston in the year before the Boston Tea Party. So when the East India Company begins to ship its own tea directly, which is new, so the tea that was auctioned in Britain previously, auctioned in London, and carried over to Boston for sale in 1771 and 1772. That's tea from the East India Company, just resold. And then in 1773, they shipped their tea directly there. And this is a problem because the East India Company, it's clearly, right, the Parliament is trying to, they're politicians. They're trying to find the path of least resistance to get where they need to go. And it seems like there isn't much colonial resistance to this tax on tea because it's being paid in 1771 and 72. So I think, well, since it's not a problem, we'll just have the East India Company ship tea directly because you guys in the colonies are like that. It cuts costs even further. So now your tea will cost even less. And so then what Parliament does is it renews its previous tax on tea and then provides this new cost-cutting measure with the East India Company's direct shipments. And colonies protest this because they're realizing that they've left open this hole through which now Parliament has established this precedent of taxing the colonies. And so they talk, people like John Adams, really talk about how they want to avoid the precedent of Parliament taxing the colonies. That's why they have to do the Boston Tea Party. But I don't know whether they're lying to themselves or whether they're aware that they're lying to themselves or not. But clearly, they'd been paying that tax for a couple of years already. So there was no precedent left. But so therefore, to recover from this problem, they need to stop these tea shipments. And so Parliament ships tea to 4 cities, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, or rather the East India Company ships tea with parliamentary authorization to these cities. And in Boston and New York, they organize crowds, of course, by Sons of Liberty there, turn the ships around, and the ships go back to England. And in Boston, they don't turn around. They get too far into the customs zone and they're not allowed to turn around. And so what that means is that now in the city that's been consuming the most taxed tea that comes from the East India Company, now there's this large shipment of tea coming in. And so this becomes the worst city for them to have a problem with. And in New York and Philadelphia, they had been importing large amounts of tea illegally from the Netherlands. So there was an alternative supply, but the Bostonians didn't have that economic connection with Europe as much. So they were unable to replace it as much. So therefore, tea became this problem. If it's not destroyed, it forces the revolutionary leadership to admit that they failed on this point. So it is this moment either when they can take back their previous mistakes or they can accept a major defeat. And that's why it becomes a big denouement there.
And you're writing a book about the Boston Tea Party at the moment, and you've done a lot of work on the tea itself. We commonly hear, I think, that something like 340 chests of tea are destroyed. Do we know how accurate that number is?
That's pretty accurate. The East India Company kept good records because, like all large corporations, they asked Parliament for a bailout the moment that things went badly. So they gave Parliament an itemized list of what had been destroyed. It comes to a question of whether you count the half chests and quarter chests as chests or as halves and quarters of a chest. That's destroyed, but not all of the tea that's sent to Boston is destroyed. What's weird about the Boston case is that for New York and for Philadelphia, the East India Company hired, it wasn't one of these expensive East India Company ships they sent out to China. Those were ones that were separate. They hired just a normal transatlantic sailor, and they said, okay, we'll hire you to take our big shipment of tea to New York, which was about 200,000 pounds, and another 200,000 pounds that shipped to Philadelphia, and a little more than 200. But they can't find a big ship that has space going to Boston. So they get 4 ships that have a little bit of space across all 4 of them to bring the tea to Boston. And this means that the tea that's coming into Boston is coming in drips over 4 different vessels. So the 20-day countdown is 20 days from when the first of the 4 ships reached Boston. But there was another ship that came a couple days later, and it had a different 20-day countdown. But of course, people talk in game theory and in politics about repeated games. Once you do it the first time and the other side knows what you're doing, they're going to try to prevent you from doing it the second time. So they can't just destroy the tea on the first ship, because then they figure, well, the officials will take the second ship and just move it away from the dock, so we can't destroy it. So we need to get them all at the same time, even though the countdown doesn't apply to them. And they barely made it. The first and second ship were at dock, and the third ship arrived in Boston a week before the Tea Party, and had a case of smallpox, horrifyingly dangerous, and is not something that they wanted to have in Boston. So the ship had to dock at a quarantine island for a week, and the tea had to be removed from the ship and left open on the island so that it could air out. They thought airing things out prevented smallpox, so they let it air out for a week, and then reloaded it and brought it in, and it arrives on the dock next to the other 2 ships on December 15th, the day before the Boston Tea Party. So that was the 16th or the 15th were the only days that they could even get all 3 of those ships. And there's a 4th ship that had already wrecked off Cape Cod, and that had the last of this shipment. And as it turns out, that ship wrecked and the tea survived. And so it became this problem of, how do you deal with this tea? And correctly, right, the government officials, the governor, the naval officers, customs officers, immediately, army commanders, suddenly their conservatism and upper class unwillingness to think outside the box is replaced by rapid, effective action. And they quickly find a solution where this tea will be locked up in the castle. Castle William was the island castle that guarded Boston Harbor. And they lock it up there to keep it protected. And it sits in Boston or in this castle throughout 1774, potentially available for sale, therefore threatening the plausibility of the boycott movement by its very presence. And so this is part of what keeps Boston politics so hot.
Fascinating. So many layers to what's going on, isn't there? Do we get a sense of the value of the tea that was destroyed, and how economically important, how damaging for the East India Company and British taxes this was?
It was irrelevant for the East India Company. It was about 9,000 pounds sterling at the time, which, I mean, when you think about the money back then, you think, oh gosh, 9,000 could be a lot. But actually, the East India Company was separately getting at the time a massive government bailout. That was for, I think, 1.4 million. And they paid back the bailout by 1776. So both the scale of the bailout and the scale of it was a loan from the Treasury. The scale of the bailout and the scale of the degree to which the company can pay something like that off within just 2 or 3 years, right, suggests that 9,000 pounds was a nothing. But what mattered was the principle of the money. And so the ministry responds to this by saying, we want to make Boston pay for the destroyed tea because you did a bad thing and you need to admit what you've done is bad, and paying will be the admission. And therefore, they think, well, we can't bring criminal charges, so we have to solve this politically. And the political solution is to force Boston to be obedient and to stop being riotous and chaotic. Therefore, we're going to make the town leadership, or maybe the colony leadership, colony of Massachusetts, pay from town or colonial treasury to pay for the tea, which is, again, it's only 9,000 pounds. It's not a lot. And this will, because that local political leadership will be doing it, they will have to enforce order to make sure it doesn't happen again. This will therefore ensure that the empire and stability continues. So that's the plan. And so they passed the Boston Port Act, which is meant to close the harbor of Boston until the tea is paid for. And I think it's like one of the biggest miscalculations, because it moves the decision-making power in terms of who can decide what action is taken from Parliament to the colonies. If the Parliament had said, we're going to close the port of Boston for 2 months as punishment and then reopen it, then both the closure and the opening are up to Parliament. It's making decisions. It has power. But by saying, we're going to close the port of Boston until the protesters do something, then if the protesters don't listen and don't do it, they retain decision-making authority. They've forced Parliament to either stick to its original law or backtrack, in which case it's Parliament that looks weak, not the protesters. So it's by saying they're going to keep the port closed until the tea is paid for, it leaves the issue of whether the tea is paid for up to the protesters. It leaves the determination of what counts as paying for it up to the protesters. There was this question from, I think, a senatorial question during the American War in Vietnam, where one senator said, well, why don't we just declare victory and go home? And this is actually something Parliament could have done. They could have just said, well, we'll close it for a month, declare victory, and move on. And that would have been sufficient. But they hadn't done that. They didn't do that. And therefore, they conceded more power than they meant to in this moment where they thought they were seizing power.
Yeah, I was going to say, it almost sounds like accidentally Parliament in Britain has made more of the Boston Tea Party than there might otherwise have been if they'd, as you say, that's an unfortunate moment. We'll have a bit of a sanction about it, but then we'll move on and pretend like it never happened. But by driving all of this focus to it, and as you say, by moving the resolution out of the hands of Parliament and into the hands of the protesters, and thereby empowering them to say that if you keep up your protest, you are actively defying successfully British Parliament and the Empire. You make them look and feel so much more powerful than they might have been. So it's almost like the poor handling of the situation creates something out of the Boston Tea Party that it might not otherwise have been.
Exactly. I mean, it gives meaning to their actions that wasn't necessarily there. And, but it makes sense because, like, if you think about what these MPs are like these people, Lord North in particular, but a lot there was a pro-American minority in Parliament, largely sugar interests from the Caribbean, but there was a pro-American minority. But the kind of MPs we're talking about are people who obviously they've never been to the colonies, but also they are wheelers and dealers. This is a Parliament in which everything is a deal. People are buying each other off all the time, literally, and also just buying different factions and bringing them in and out of government. But the space that you can make deals is limited to this aristocratic upper class that is in and out of the House of Lords and House of Commons. It's not in amongst the common people. And so the idea that you would make deals with these kinds of people that are in the colonies, they are people to be governed. It would be the case of the people of Manchester as well. So there's no real sense that there's a political deal to be made, and that the colonies are a place where politics can happen. And conversely, the loyalists who want to be political actors in the colony and supporting the crown, mentally, they're such loyalists that they think in such hierarchical terms. They're waiting for marching orders from London about what to do because they're good, hierarchical rule follower types. And so they never get the marching orders about what to do. And they're not like, action-taking, creative thinking people that come up with solutions on their own. And so they remain this weaker minority that's never able to match the patriots in their ability to articulate a vision for how to go forward.
I mean, this has been so fascinating, James. I felt like coming into this, I was just going to be outraged at the idea of tea being wasted, which nobody likes to see. But actually, it's so fascinating how many layers there are to what's going on, and how many points at which it might have taken a different turn and might have meant nothing and ended up meaning so much more than it otherwise would have. I mean, I'm looking forward to your book on the Boston Tea Party. Now, I understand you're working on a book on slavery during the American Revolution as well at the moment.
Yes, I'm working on my previous book, Tea, is on the broader tea protest movement of 73 to 76. And I'm working on a short narrative history just of the Boston Tea Party itself. My work in the book Tea points to the survival of tea in Boston, and actually also the entire Charleston shipment survived. And both the Boston and Charleston teas were eventually drunk in the colonies at different moments with different political meanings by loyalists and by patriots. So tea could be rehabilitated. So I'm writing about that storyline. The other thing I'm working on a book on the slave trade during the American Revolution, and the association which bans American trade with Britain. The second article is a ban on the North American slave trade, which on paper seems to stop for about a decade. And we've long seen this as this high watermark in the abolitionist movement in North America. Yet the slave trade definitely continued. And the couple obvious points of that are the British slave trade was 80 to 90% of the slave trade that English speakers undertook. There's the slave trade out of Liverpool and Bristol and London. It was much bigger than what happened out of Charleston, Rhode Island, and New York. So many North Americans just ended up being British and sailing on British ships and doing the British slave trade. But also the British slave trade was very big, and therefore American privateers started attacking British slave ships, taking the slaves and then just selling them to the French. And so they ended up probably getting more slaves, selling and trading more enslaved captives, more prisoners this way than they would have if they had been doing the transatlantic slave trade that they had been doing previously. And to the other point, to the thing you were saying about the ways things can go differently, and one of the funny things is patriots banned tea in the colonies, and unlike Parliament with its rules, the patriots were smart enough to not enforce the rules, which in some ways, like having a rule that's lightly enforced is, you could say, is more British than American. But it is the patriots that go and they say they ban tea, but then they very carefully don't check if people are actually not drinking tea in their houses, because they know that if they actually sent inspectors going door to door, they would make themselves very obnoxious very quickly. And they want to win hearts and minds. And so they ask colonists to say, do you promise not to drink tea? And the colonists say yes. And then the patriots don't check, but they take the yes as a consent for the patriot leadership to govern. And then they just move on to the next topic. So they did a much better job of this quick move on to the next subject without becoming obnoxious, right? Because of course they're objecting to things like customs inspectors and this very much this kind of inspecting.
And before we finish, James, I always like to offer guests the opportunity to step into the Assassin's Creed animus, to travel back in time. So is there a moment around the Boston Tea Party in the planning phases, in the execution of it, or the aftermath? Is there something that you would like to have witnessed?
The Tea Party itself would have been a fascinating thing to witness, just because the witness statements about what happened in the Boston Tea Party are so bad. Going through and trying to write this story of what happened. The witness statements are things like, I was 100 yards away and I didn't really see anything, but there was a large crowd. So I would have liked to have seen that. And the other thing I'm quite curious about is the ship that was wrecked on Cape Cod. The rescue of it is very fascinating. And the way that this worked, they started sending riders out to Boston to let Boston know that this tea had survived, asking what to do. And Boston didn't want to say on paper that we are telling you to commit a crime, because they didn't want to leave a paper trail. So they just keep on writing back things like, we trust your good judgment, that you'll do what's best for the country, kind of a vague but obvious kind of wording. So I would have loved to be able to hear people's deliberations about how to say go commit a crime without saying go commit a crime, as they're debating how to word this on paper.
Yeah, and hear the difference between what they're willing to say in a room and what they're willing to write down.
Exactly.
This has been really, really interesting. Thank you so much, James, for sharing with us all of your expertise about the Boston Tea Party and about tea and about all of these events that lead up to the American Revolution. It's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you.
Well, the pleasure's mine, Matt. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks for watching Echoes of History. If you've enjoyed this video and want to learn more about the real history behind the Assassin's Creed games, then subscribe for more episodes. You can check out the extended interviews wherever you get your podcasts by clicking on the link in the description. And you should probably also click one of the links that's somewhere on the screen. Wherever they are, do it